Tuau, welcome to the Youth Live Canada Facebook event. My name is Max Finday. I come from the Sweetgrass First Nation in Saskatchewan Treaty 6 territory, and I'm the co-executive director of Canadian Roots Exchange. Today we're coming at you live from Sudbury, Ontario, Atikameksheng, Anishinaabeg traditional territory, and we're going to have a great conversation with some youth leaders about what reconciliation means today. I encourage you to follow along and send in your questions. You can do this through the Facebook channel, Canadian Roots Exchange. You can tweet at us using hashtag YouthLiveCanada, or you can send in your questions via email to youthlive2018@canadianroots.ca. Now, we're going to be experiencing a large audience today, so we encourage you to send in your questions. We might not get to every question that's asked, but we certainly do encourage this participation. Some of the themes that we're going to be speaking about today are language and cultural revitalization, towards a renewed relationship, identity and stereotypes, and advice and wisdom. Now, we're here along with 250 other young people from every province and territory talking about what reconciliation means as a part of the 6th annual Canadian Roots Exchange National Youth Gathering. Now, as I mentioned before, we have some great panelists for you today who are going to share about their experiences, their learnings, and their visions for what that renewed relationship, nation to nation, and reconciliation looks like for the next generation. We're going to introduce them to you now. Tansi Kakiao. My name is Max Finday. I'm Cree from the Sweetgrass First Nation in Saskatchewan Treaty 6 territory. What I'm passionate about is bringing Indigenous and non-Indigenous people together to advance the relationship.
Anine Boujou. My name is Kakike Thundersky. I am Anishinaabe from Poplar River First Nation. I am passionate about AYO, which is Aboriginal Youth Opportunities to help stop the violence and reclaim the streets.
My name's Isaiah McEwen Phillip, and I'm from Iqaluit Nunavut. What I want is youth back home to realize that they have the skills, they have the capacity, they have what it takes.
My name is Dallas Fiddler. I'm Cree from the Water and Lake First Nation in Saskatchewan. I'm interested in identifying policy that has prevented First Nations people from flourishing.
My name is Karen Tutanno, Inuit from Rinkin Inlet, Nunavut. I went down south to learn about my Inuit heritage. Now I'm in university to learn about other cultures.
Tanse, my name is Justin Weeb. I'm Métis from Saskatchewan. I grew up in Saskatoon. I'm passionate about Indigenous Innovation, which is about taking our traditions, our cultures, our languages, and really finding ways that they can be useful today.
Tamshi, my name is Lindsay Dupre, and I'm Métis from Toronto. My passion is working with other First Nation, Métis, and Inuit youth on collaborative resistance and healing, leveraging our gifts and traditional knowledge to improve our communities and live stronger and healthier.
Well, as you saw, we have some great leaders sitting with us today who are going to be speaking to us about what reconciliation looks like in 2018 for young people. They're all very passionate, coming from across Canada, different age ranges. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being with me today. So the first question that we're going to ask, we're going to dive into what does a renewed relationship really look like? And the first question, Justin, I'm going to pose it to you is, what does reconciliation mean to you?
Awesome, thanks, Max. For me, reconciliation is really about rebuilding relationships. It's about telling the truth about the real history in this country, so all Canadians understand the real origins of this country, and we're honest and upfront about what's happened here. And then it's about naming injustice as it happened historically, but also as it continues to happen today for particular communities. I think we need to really focus on rebuilding relationships between communities, and particularly, I think, the relationship between Indigenous folks, Black people in this country, to really think about and understand how we can build a future that's inclusive of all people, that everyone has opportunity in this country to be who they want to be.
That's great. If I could just ask a follow-up. You talk about injustices that continue to happen today. Could you give our viewers who are at home, who are in schools, who might be young people, might be some adult allies, could you give them an example of some of the injustices that you see as a young Indigenous person that are happening today in Canada?
For sure. I mean, I think we don't have to look too far in the media to see the realities in many Indigenous communities in this country, which for me is frankly unacceptable. Many of you may have been hearing of the conversations happening, back home where I'm from in Saskatchewan, around the Gerald Stanley case. Injustices are everywhere in this country, and not just for Indigenous people. And so when Indigenous people are followed in stores, when Black folks are carted by the police, these injustices are not just impacting Indigenous people as well; they are impacting a range of communities. But so I think we need to be real about those things. We need to have those hard conversations, because only through those conversations, where we connect with each other, where we hear each other's stories, where we understand where people are coming from, can we build something that's more inclusive.
Karen?
So reconciliation to me is more personal. I believe to teach or to I guess to learn more, you have to reconcile with yourself. For me, I don't know, it's very personal.
Lindsay?
I guess what I would add is the fact that reconciliation is a process. So often the language that you hear being used about reconciliation is, have we achieved it, or will we get there? And if we're talking about reconciliation from Indigenous worldview, it's understanding that this is all about relationships, and relationships are not a static thing. They're constantly evolving and take continuous commitment and work. And so I think that if we are going to continue evolving our relationships here on these territories, we need to commit to that in its entirety, the entire process.
For myself, reconciliation means relearning the history of colonization. And the key word here is history. You may have heard history is written by the victors, and now we need to rewrite history, but from a perspective of Indigenous peoples, or the original peoples, or the people that have experienced or are still experiencing colonialism on a day-to-day basis. And so for myself, once again, reconciliation is to relearn where we are all coming from in this process.
Reconciliation for me is about being able to control the narrative. The narrative hasn't necessarily been controlled by Indigenous folks, and continues to be controlled by the government, the media, and Indigenous people across Canada are underrepresented in the media. And I think it's about telling our story and having everyone listen to the realities Indigenous people face every day. It's we're living in challenging times, and I think it speaks to where we're going in this country. And there have been a lot of people who've reached out to Indigenous people to listen to their stories, and we've had some in our country that have turned our words and our ask into action, and we have others who have continued to put Indigenous folks in the back burner. So I think it's really turning words into action.
So for me, I might get a little bit of backlash, but I think reconciliation is just kind of a buzzword at the moment. I still think there's a lot of things that need to be done in order for reconciliation to happen, and it's just not happening. So for now, it's just a word to me.
That's great. Thank you all so much for sharing. We know that reconciliation is going to look different for each person. Karen talked about how it was personal. Justin linked it to systems, for sure. And reconciliation, or renewing that relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, is going to look different in every region of this country as well. Isaiah, I want to go back to something that you said about learning and unlearning. What roles do you think our education system plays in advancing reconciliation?
So our education system, even on every provincial level, it's rooted in the colonial teachings that we see in our schools every day. Now, as an Inuk, having grown up down in the south, Inuk from the Arctic, grew up in Quebec City. History class. Here's the history of Quebec. Here's everything what the colonizers have done. And there were 3 Indigenous groups in the region. The Indigenous groups were either nomadic or sedentary. This is what they ate, and that's about it. Nothing about what our teachings were, nothing about the taking over the land, nothing like that. So, back to what's happening today, or what has to be unlearned and learned again, is we need to have both, not only Indigenous folks, but Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to be collaborating together to reteach the world, or a smaller extent, the Canadians, and our justice and our education system, what's happening and what has happened.
Yeah, thanks so much. We're here on the beautiful Laurentian University campus today. Laurentian has done a great number of things and started initiatives to, again, advance that relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Can I just ask, show of hands, who thinks they received an adequate education that had, an education that had adequate Indigenous content built in the curriculum? Does anyone feel that way? Like they had enough Indigenous content built into the curriculum? How about any content?
I know in Nunavut, we had like a class for 45 minutes that taught the traditional ways. And then we had an Inuktitut class, but it was, I don't know, I don't think, it might be different now, but they didn't take it seriously. Or I know I didn't. And I can say that now, but now I'm proud to be Inuk. Like,
for sure. Yeah, Lindsay, please.
I think it is a matter of content, but it's also about how education is being done when we think of how it's perpetuating colonialism. So the way the education system is set up right now is still under this idea that knowledge is void of emotions. And we know from our ways of learning that embracing our emotions and holistic approaches to learning are so important, and experiential learning. And I think that ties into what we're trying to do with this gathering, with Canadian Roots Exchange, is bringing people together to talk, to feel, and to experience things together to actually build meaningful relationships instead of just a checklist of facts that people can learn.
Justin, I know that you're an educator and you've worked a lot with Indigenous students and non-Indigenous students. Can you talk a little bit about some of the successes and some of the failures that you've seen in classrooms?
Sure, yeah. I think first, and I alluded to this earlier, I think in the education system, I think we need to be very truthful about the history in this country. And I think we need to recognize that Canada was built on the theft of Indigenous lands and on the backs of enslaved black bodies. I think we need to be very real about the history of this place and recognizing that Canada is built on the marginalization and colonialism of two peoples, of Indigenous folks and black folks. So I think we need to start there. We need to have those conversations with people. We need to name those things. People need to understand how Canada comes to be. But from there, I think what we need to do is we need to create an environment where young people can have conversations, right? Where they can learn about each other's experience. When I was teaching, we spent a lot of time outside of the classroom, right? We were going, where I taught in Saskatoon. We would spend time, in different parts of the city, connecting with people from the community, having conversations again, and getting young people engaged. Because I think the school system, in its kind of early times, its origins, was really a tool about getting people to follow instructions, which is important. I think people need to understand and to be able to follow some level of rule. But I think we also need to name that people also need to be able to think critically about what's going on around them. And so that's what I try to do in the classroom is take young people outside of those four walls, not have people necessarily sit in rows. Go out to the community, hear what's going on, find your place in it, and see how you can give back. And so I think that's a really key way. And then it's about how we value knowledge and expertise. And so when we're thinking about, it's not just what's on the paper, it's those elders in our communities, it's those community activists who have been doing work in the community for so long, it's the land itself that we can learn from. And so we need to look to those people, to our lands, our languages, our teachings, as other forms of expertise, and center those in any conversation, center those in our classrooms.
Before I ask the next question, I just want to remind our viewers, you can send questions through the Facebook page at Canadian Roots Exchange using the hashtag YouthLiveCanada or via email, youthlive2018@canadianroots.ca. Now, we only have a few more minutes left for this session, but I want to get one question. I want to pose one question to you all. If you were speaking to Indigenous leadership today about what young people need support on and how our Indigenous leadership could support young people, what would you say to them?
Sure, I'll jump in. I think what I am looking for from our Indigenous leadership is the backing of our gifts and the backing of our passion in ways that aren't tokenistic. So as Indigenous youth, we're often put into positions, whether that's on different councils or in organizations, where we are there to just be a check mark. And that's true across the board in Indigenous and non-Indigenous settings. And so what I'm really hoping that our Indigenous leadership can do for us is to start calling that out and holding themselves accountable to holding us up as valuable members of our communities and helping us find our place in the circle that actually leverages our gifts instead of just expecting us to sit there silently. Our leadership is important and needed right now, and we need that support.
I think another one would be just ensuring Indigenous leaders are looking out for the future generations. I think some of the decisions Indigenous leaderships have made haven't gone far enough generationally. I remember hearing a story in my treaty territory, Treaty 6 territory in Saskatchewan, where if a decision is not going to help out 7 generations ahead, then it's a bad decision. And I guess in a time where decisions are being made quickly, it's difficult for Indigenous leaders to keep that in mind. So, if they, to keep that in mind. Sorry.
Anybody else have thoughts on this, Justin? Okay.
I think another important part of is how we understand leadership and who we see as leaders, right? And so I think for me, it is about those elected, our elected community members, those people who are leading in very formal senses, but we also have to name and acknowledge and recognize the leaders that are everywhere. I'm on this panel with a group of amazing young leaders here who have expertise, and so when I look to our formal, elected leaders, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, I say connect with those young people, have those conversations, because I think we know what we need, and so how do we view leadership and recognize that young people are leaders in their own way as well.
Karen, you wanted to say something, I don't know.
I think I want to include the isolated communities in Nunavut, in Nunavik, Inuit, Nunangat, the northern part of Canada. I feel like that part is always forgotten, and maybe because I'm from Rincon, and anytime I see a family member or a young person who has the potential to be a leader, I say it to them, and like just to encourage, I don't know if someone already said it, but like to encourage our youth.
Great. We're going to move on to the next theme, which is language and cultural revitalization. And again, I encourage folks to send in their questions. I want to ask very broadly, you know, our languages are so beautiful. There's over 70 Indigenous languages in Canada. Our cultures are so beautiful. They're so vibrant. What does cultural revitalization mean to you, or what does it look like to you as young people?
I think language is a key part of nation building. I personally grew up, my first 2 years of education were Cree immersion at the Onion Lake Cree Nation, and so I had the privilege of learning my language at a very young age, and also, you know, and when I moved to Regina, you know, a 7-8 hour drive, I walked into my grade 1 class, and I remember the teacher asking me to go to a resource room. And one of the reasons for that is because I didn't know English, because Cree was my first language I learned, and I think it followed me all throughout my education degree, all throughout my education journey. You know, right up to grade 12, right up to university, and so I think language is important. It becomes very difficult to protect the culture unless we protect the language as well, and so I think we need to remember that, and you know, think of new ways to establish language revitalization programs across Canada.
Yeah, I mean, I think language is key. I had spent some time in Aotearoa in New Zealand not too long ago, and I think there's some really amazing work there happening around language revitalization. So I think we can look to other Indigenous peoples around the world and who have a similar experience of colonialism in some way, and look to what they've done to revitalize language. So I think there's a lot of really important pieces there. Some folks on the panel might laugh, but I also want to name Indigenous Innovation. And so how do we look to our languages, our traditions, our culture, and not just as something that's kind of static, and not just as something from the past, but as something that can guide us into the future as well. And so when we look to our traditions, Indigenous science, epistemologies, all of those things, you know, Western science in a lot of ways is still kind of catching up to some of our thought, some of the thinking that Indigenous elders have had for millennia. And so I think we need to name that expertise that exists within our communities and within our Indigenous systems, and use those grounding innovation, grounding thinking in Indigenous thought to really guide us into the future and solve some of the complex problems that we're dealing with today and we're going to deal with tomorrow. I think Indigenous thought, Indigenous culture has answers to a lot of the problems that we're dealing with today and we'll deal with tomorrow.
Jump in here. So for a big part of the revitalization is, as we've mentioned already, is language. Now, language is such a core part of any culture, and not any less our Indigenous cultures. A key, really important, is for us youth to get out of a rut that I see so often, that my peers see often, and I see it myself as well. To not shy away from asking and trying to learn our Indigenous languages, because it's up to us. We're the next generation, and we have in a way, we have the resources, but the knowledge is on earth with us right now, or at least standing with us right now. And it's up to us to, as I've mentioned, get out of the rut and to, not be shy to try the words. If you want, we're all in here together. We can laugh at each other's faces there if we're saying our words a little funny, but we'll all be doing all that at the same time, So it's something I would like to encourage for everyone, myself, and everyone around.
I agree, and I think we can do that together, as you said. And as Indigenous young people across our communities, colonization has tried to separate us and create divides. The divide isn't just Indigenous, non-Indigenous. So how can we start learning about these things and doing cultural revitalization work together? because we're experiencing similar things. There's important differences and diversity across our communities, but there's a lot that ties us together, and there's a lot of teachings that ground us and connect us all. So I'm fortunate to have worked with a lot of First Nation Métis and Inuit young people, and when we have these opportunities to share with one another where our traditional knowledge is coming from, we can start finding ourselves through our connected relationships and histories.
Now, I know a lot of classrooms are watching. There's a lot of young kids watching us today. And, you know, I'm a big believer, just like Isaiah, that people need to begin speaking the language. Just one word or two words. Is there one word that you'd like to share with all the kids watching from your language that they could maybe practice right now as they're watching along with us? Your favorite word in your language.
One term that I like is, and please correct me, Karen, if I'm wrong, ayongitutit. Ayongitutit, or I think it means you're able, or you're good, you're capable, you have the capacity. Ayongitutit, you have it, you got it, you have what it takes.
Biksqui means talk, speak. Yeah.
Why is that the word that you choose?
I think I just believe it's important for us to just speak it. Speak it at dinner tables. I remember me and a friend of mine, we went for a walk and we were trying to translate some history, I guess, the constitutional talks into Cree. So we tried our best, and it was a very interesting conversation. We had nobody around us to laugh except laughing at each other, and so yeah, it was a learning experience as well.
So I'm gonna keep it pretty basic. Anim Buju, which just is like greeting, someone like saying hi, because that's the first thing you say when you meet someone. It's an Anishinaabe Moin.
Anybody else?
Kanuipi. How are you?
I would say Imachif Pishap Mishko, which means take care. So in a lot of our languages, there isn't a way for saying goodbye. So a lot of us say, like, see you again, or for us, Pishap Mishko, take care.
One of my favorite words, rababu, rabbit stew. We need to eat. We always need to eat. And I think for Indigenous peoples in particular, those conversations over food, that's when we come together, when we gather. And so, rababu.
Thank you all for sharing so much. We have our first question from Kodo Swiftwolf. They ask, how does cultural revitalization look for urban Indigenous populations? And that's something we're increasingly thinking of as more people move to cities. How do we keep that connection to our language? And how do we keep that connection to our culture? Thanks so much for that question, Koda.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in. I think I live in Toronto now, and I'm lucky enough to work with some amazing young people, not just in Toronto, but across the province. And there's an organization I want to give a shout out to, a grassroots organization called Nadmagitki Group, NKG. And what they do, they're a predominantly group of young people, young Indigenous folks who live in Toronto, and they are basically returning parts of along the Humber River to its Indigenous states. And so they are pulling out all of the invasive species. They are in the middle of the city, along the Humber River, are reconnecting with land. And so they're out there, they're pulling the weeds, they're pulling those invasive species. They've built lodges out there, they host ceremonies along the river there. And so I think that's partially it. It's within the city we need to recognize that the land is still there. There might be some cement on it, there might be buildings on it, but the land is still there. We just have to remember it and find those places, even within the city, that we can connect to. Because long before the concrete was poured and the cement buildings were built, those were our territories, and they still are, and we still have those connections. So I think that's a way. I think they're finding ways to connect with your friends and speak your language. Don't be afraid to speak it on the bus, walking down the street. We need to make sure that people know that we're still here and we're in the city.
That's great. Anybody else want to answer this question?
I think going back to, I guess, my territory, we have Cree, the Cree language, and there are organizations developing apps that they're developing apps, and also our libraries in the province of Saskatchewan are starting to host, are starting to invite Cree speakers, different language speakers to come and present, you know, one day out of the week. And so I think, you know, to the viewers out there who are in the cities, you know, go online maybe. Go online, go to your local library and search, see if anybody in the city or anybody in a town is offering those types of teachings.
I also want to shout out an organization in Winnipeg called AO. AO has a lot of different initiatives, and a big one they do is bringing like the ceremonies to the streets. So in a lot of different areas in our city, the streets aren't necessarily seen as a good thing. It's seen as like kind of violent in some people's eyes, and it's not a good place because some people are like using and like substances. So what some members of AO do is they bring like pipe ceremonies to the streets because that's where it's needed. Why not make that space sacred and bring it to the people who need to heal? So, you know, it's kind of similar to that.
And our urban centers have long histories behind them. So I think it's really important for people in all of these cities to learn about the history of where they are. So for us in Toronto, you know, instead of just doing a land acknowledgement and giving acknowledgement to the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, thinking about the history of Dish with One Spoon Treaty. And what does that mean for us as a living agreement that we have responsibility to? When we talk about culture, sometimes people think it's in the past, but it's in the present and it's also in the future. And so no matter what spaces we're in, we have to walk that in a good way and carry all these teachings that are tied to these places that we're in.
So I live in Montreal for school. I don't consider myself an urban Indigenous because I go back home during the holidays and the summertime. But since being in Montreal, I went to go visit the Native Montreal Center. And there's so many different Indigenous groups in Montreal. Like there's many Inuit, many Cree, many Haudenosaunee. Like I think like getting to know all the groups, it would be awesome. I'm gonna do that.
Now, I want to ask you a question about a specific day that happens every year. June 21st, we know as National Aboriginal Day, but this year the name is actually changing to National Indigenous Peoples Day. So could you tell me a little bit about what you do on National Indigenous Peoples Day, or what it means to you?
So I'm always home. I'm always in Rankin on National Indigenous Peoples Day.
It's going to take some getting used to.
It's a mouthful. Yeah.
So in my community, after work, we celebrate. We have like traditional wear contests, throat singing, drum dancing. We square dance. It's super fun. Yeah, we celebrate that day.
Yeah, I think similarly for me, it's about celebration. So usually I'm with family, with friends, eating way too much probably. But I think it's also a time to remember and to celebrate and to remember all the work of those people who have come before us. Our ancestors, all those people who have put in, the hard work to get us to where we are today, and to celebrate our existence as Indigenous peoples. Because I think, the intention, if we're being truthful, and I guess I'm being extra truthful today, is that Indigenous people weren't supposed to exist. I think that's part of it is, and so on Indigenous Peoples Day, it's celebrating our existence, remembering those people before us, and looking to the future, and knowing that we're here today, we were here yesterday, and we're going to be here tomorrow. And so, to the rest of Canada, you should get to know us, because we're going to be here. So.
Yeah, I'm kind of worried about National Indigenous Peoples Day. I think, as Justin mentioned, celebrating who we are and our existence here is important, but to put that on one day is, really challenging for me, because I think that's what is being done to us, is we're being put into these boxes and given a little bit here and there of acknowledgement when this needs to be talked about and celebrated every single day. You know, you're not only colonizing these territories one day a year, the country is doing that every single day. And so let's celebrate who we are on that day and use it as an extra excuse to come together and to hold different gatherings. But let's not have reconciliation be appropriated and have these gestures be the end of what we expect from the government, from corporations, and from non-Indigenous people in this country as a whole.
I think every day is, you know, Indigenous Peoples' Day. You know, it's a day to, I guess, you know, waking up in the morning, saying how grateful you are to be alive. There's some pride in that, and so, you know, if I never left my community, I learned that growing up. I've learned to be proud of, to be grateful for today, and so, you know, Indigenous Peoples' Day is, you know, November 21st, and you know, to really, for it to be focused just on one day is kind of iffy, I guess, on my part. So, to my understanding, yeah.
It's a big part of understanding what's Indigenous. Would at least to at least know who are the Indigenous peoples in Canada. If we're going to have a national Indigenous Peoples Day, we would hope for everyone to know what Indigenous is and the differences between Inuit, First Nations, and Métis. And I had a point there. And how we each, like everyone, has to know, like at the basics at least. And that's why it's still in the process, and it can't just happen in one day.
Okay, well, in my city, we have like Aboriginal Day Live through like APTN. So it's just like a big celebration at the Forks with like a powwow. There's throat singing, there's like jigging contests. And you can kind of just walk around and like experience all the different, I guess, like ways of like showing culture through like different groups in Manitoba. And it's just kind of an excuse to just have a fun day, celebrate, and then there's that free concert at night. So, I don't know, it's just a lot of fun. Kind of lucky to be in Winnipeg for that day.
Sounds like a lot of fun. We'll have to come to Winnipeg for National Indigenous Peoples Day. Bouncing off of an idea that Isaiah had, that we need to acknowledge the differences between First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. I think that's a powerful point that a lot of Canadians still haven't grasped onto. That Indigenous peoples, there's some beautiful differences, there's some beautiful similarities, but there's uniquenesses in all parts of our culture. So going into the next theme of identity and stereotypes, I'd like to start off by asking, what makes you proud to be First Nations, or to be Métis, or to be Inuk? What are those things that immediately come to mind for you that make you proud?
Having a strong connection to the land is for me personally. I came to understand that, you know, as Indigenous people, we look after the land, but in return, it looks after us. And so I think that's an important part of that.
As an Inuk, being proud to be Inuk really is, as you mentioned, it's tied to the land. We gain rights, fighting over decades, fighting to have control over our lives and over our lives on the land that we live on. Nunavut meaning our land, is a territory created through negotiations and through land claims. Nunatsiavut, I think that means our beautiful land, is what having the power for this Indigenous group to come together and fight for our rights, like the people in the past have done and people still do today. That's what makes me proud to be part of and to be from the Arctic. It was pretty cool too.
For me, being Métis, I'm proud to be part of a community that has set the stage for what reconciliation could look like. If we put aside the actual word reconciliation, our communities have carried through these values of working together in harmony and having respect for a long time. And so the Métis community, we, to pull out a myth, or to call out a myth, we are not just mixed people. We are a distinct group that has a specific history and homeland. And so as Métis people, we have responsibility to that history and should be proud of it as people who come from two distinct backgrounds. The infinity flag of our community represents the two different sides of us, our First Nations ancestors and our European ancestors. And sometimes youth are having trouble negotiating these different parts of our identities, but it is something to be proud of. And if we want to learn about how to move forward as a country and rebuilding these relationships, I think Métis young people specifically have a lot of potential in this space, but also a lot of responsibilities. And also part of those responsibilities is acknowledging those of us that carry white passing privilege, so who present in a certain way. What does that look like for us? How does that impact how we can influence our communities and how we can celebrate who we are on both sides?
Wow, I actually didn't know that was the history of the Métis flag. So that's something, I'm sure a lot of Canadians didn't know. That might be the most Métis education that a lot of viewers have had in their entire schooling. So thank you for that, Lindsay. Others?
What came to my mind right away is what me and my friends called being unapologetically Nietzsche. It's when we're just loud and proud, cracking jokes, laughter is medicine, and just being around them, understanding each other, that's what makes me proud.
For me, I wasn't proud to be Inuk for a while until I went down south and learned my history. That's where I found my voice. And ever since then, like I can teach, I can talk, like yeah. I'm very proud to be Inuk now.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think it's about it's about my ancestors that make me most proud of Métis people. For those who don't know, we have a very proud history of resistance, but also of relationship building. And so to know those stories, not just the stories of our really regarded leaders, Lou Riel, Gabriel Dumont, but to know those folks who have come after, people who are around today, like Maria Campbell, and I think about my own family, Métis folks who fought for Canada. We fought on all sides of this, on all sides of this country. We fought against Canada. We fought for Canada. And so to understand those stories of where we've come from and how we are today. I always, whenever I'm home, I spend time with my grandma, with my kukum, and just try to hear, just ask her questions and tell me about what it was like growing up and the stories of our family that she has. And sometimes, I'm crying. Sometimes I'm laughing, and sometimes I'm just proud of who I am. And so, for me, it's about knowing where we come from. That gives me strength. That's what makes me most proud of who I am, to have that long history, and to be lucky enough to know who some of my ancestors are and what they've done for our community to make sure that we're here today.
For sure. Karen, you brought up an excellent point. There's a lot of young Indigenous people who aren't proud to be Indigenous. There's still people who don't know how to be unapologetically Nietzsche, who know that being Indigenous isn't just the sad stuff, the painful history, but it's also a lot of fun. It's a lot of laughter. It's a lot of jokes. What would you say to an Indigenous young person right now who might not be so proud of their identity? What advice would you give them about how to find that pride?
Learn your history. Learn your family's history. Learn your community's history. I think once you know that, then you become proud.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Karen, I think that's so important. Is all of us today? We come from such amazing and strong people, and so many attempts to destroy us, to make us feel bad about ourselves, and all of that has happened for so long and continues to happen. But we're still here, and that's something to celebrate. So our existence here is a demonstration of our individual strength, the strength of our communities, the strength of our ancestors, and we need to know those stories of where we come from and recognize all the strength that exists within our communities.
I would say, know that you're loved and that we need you. And also that it's okay to be feeling how you're feeling. Sometimes young people get rushed to just have hope and to think that everything's going to be okay when, you know, the realities that a lot of our communities are still facing are incredibly unjust. And so those feelings need to be validated, but also with the reminder that, again, everyone is loved and needed. We all have a place in the circle together and have extremely valuable gifts to contribute to the healing of ourselves, our families, our communities, and nations. And so please don't forget that you're loved, and we're all in this together, as cheesy as it sounds. We are, and we can't wait around for anyone else to fix things for us. We're the ones who know what we need in our communities, and we're going to be the ones to make that happen with love.
Quickly, it's one step at a time. As much as sometimes we don't like to hear that, sometimes when it's really small efforts, and sometimes the steps might not seem to be going forwards, but if you're moving and you're doing something, no matter how personal, no how small, or how big the feat, we're getting there.
A piece of advice would be, keep going. Indigenous youth are not the only ones who feel that way. We've had challenging times come up ongoing. They're ongoing as we're going through life. So just to keep going, find strength, and also listen. Go and maybe talk to an elder. Go and talk to someone in your community about overcoming struggle.
I would say whatever reason why you're not feeling proud, to unlearn it. And if it's a situation, just keep going and learn. That's all you can really do.
Max, could I add one last thing? I think that we also need to acknowledge all of the young people that are stepping up into leadership positions and the pressure that we're feeling. I know all of us on the panel, from conversations we've had, I can feel it here and across the youth at this gathering. Because this work is so hard and it is carrying so much pain that's connected to, this long history of violence, it's a lot to carry. It's a lot of pressure. And so I really encourage youth, including us, to take some of that weight off of our shoulders, surround yourself with people that make you laugh, make you smile, and realize that we need you, but it's also not all up to you, and to find what works for you to stay well. Because it starts with us, and we can't take care of other people unless we first take care of ourselves.
Thank you all so much. I think that's so important. My auntie, Wanda Brescape-Peters, always says, we come from a people of abundance. And I think that's so important for Indigenous young people to hear. We come from a people of abundance. And just like I think every panelist here mentioned, you are loved, you are supported. And we have a question that came in from Michael Champagne. He asks, how do we fight the suicide crisis? And we know that suicide has impacted a lot of Indigenous youth's lives. We know that the suicide rate for young Indigenous people is much higher than it is for non-Indigenous youth. that follows into adult populations as well. I want to urge anyone who's struggling to reach out and seek the help that you need. But I want to throw that question from Michael Champagne to the panel of how do we fight the suicide crisis?
I had the privilege of working with an incredible organization called We Matter. And We Matter hosted a national gathering similar to this to specifically talk about suicide prevention and life promotion. Also acknowledging that it's not just about surviving, it's thriving for our young people. And one of the key recommendations that the youth at the We Matter gathering came up with was calling out this process of flying in experts. And it's often non-Indigenous experts coming from the South, going to remote communities where they're expected to be there for a couple weeks and solve everything. We don't need Band-Aid solutions. We need long-term thinking that can support keeping our communities well. And so the youth talked to us about needing to build capacity within our communities. So as I was mentioning, there's a lot of us who are stepping into those roles of being a support for other young people, but we're feeling that pressure. So how can we build capacity amongst young people and adults in our own communities to have the skills to be able to support people who are struggling? And to do that in a good way that's grounded in our traditions and culture and not just the Western way of doing things.
I think it's important for our elders and our knowledge keepers in the communities to share their stories with struggle with the young people. I think it's there's certainly been a disconnect between some of the stories shared. You know, even in my own families, I don't think I've heard my grandparents ever tell me their story of struggle. I've heard it from my mom, and you know that's where I gained the strength. I found inspiration within their stories to continue on. And so, you know, I want to encourage, you know, maybe if there's elders listening to, you know, start sharing your stories. You know, it is difficult. It is difficult to hear, but I believe that's where our young people will find the strength to keep going.
Nice. Find your community, whether that means your own Indigenous community, whether that means a close group of friends that you grew up with, someone across the street, just and find where you can share these your own experiences. And different people have different ways of approaching the suicide crisis, whether you want to take an approach where there's organizations such as Embrace Life back in Nunavut, or and one of ITK, Inuit Kanatami's mandates is to address this suicide issue, or if you want to take it more to a personal level, person-to-person level, we each have our approach, and just find your own, find what yourself needs and what yourself wants, and that's mine.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, is that it will require many different solutions. It's not it's a complex problem, right? It requires a lot. I think one thing you know that non-Indigenous folks can do, that the media can do, is to celebrate the success, to celebrate the accomplishment of Indigenous people. I think the media often tells those sad stories about our communities, and I think it's important that the truth is told, but we also need to tell the truths of our successes. And so to find those Indigenous young people who are thriving in their communities, who are relearning their languages, who are reconnecting to the lands, who are changing the lives of their peers, and amplify those things, celebrate those people, put those people on the cover of the newspaper, tweet about those folks. Those stories of resilience, of success, of accomplishment, all of those things, that Indigenous people across this country are doing amazing, amazing things. We've been here for a day, and I've had a chance to connect with young people from all parts of this country, Indigenous folks, and just to hear some of the little things that they're doing to improve the lives of people in their community is amazing. And so, to media, to funders, to governments, find ways to connect with those people, to amplify what they're doing, to celebrate it. Because for other Indigenous young people who might feel like they don't have value or there's no hope, if they see their peers succeeding, that might just help a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? No? Great. Well, thank you so much for those answers. Thank you so much to Michael for that question. And moving on into some stereotypes that people might have. There's probably a lot of non-Indigenous Canadians who are watching today all across the country, including classrooms, but also folks who are working, maybe younger working professionals. What do you wish Canadians knew about what it's like to be an Indigenous youth? What do you wish Canadians knew, positive or negative?
So for CRE, our ranking group last year, we did the story blanket, which is behind us. And for our part in Rankin, we painted the stereotypical Inuk. And I think we did that just because non-Indigenous people in Canada, they think we're that. Like, we live in igloos and we only eat seal and stuff like that.
No electricity, no internet.
But we're so different. Like, we have TVs, we have school, we live in houses. Like, we're modern.
Snowmobiles.
Snowmobiles. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks, Kate. What else?
Yeah, I think that's an important point, that for diversity of the Indigenous community. You're looking at a very diverse group of Indigenous young people, but even within our particular nations, right? Is like we're everything. We're not just the stereotypes. And Lindsay, thank you too for naming that about our nation, our communities, the Métis people, as not merely just mixed. I still meet Indigenous folks who have a white parent and have a First Nations parent and are a little bit confused and think they're automatically Métis. It's not how it works. It comes back to a very particular history and a very particular homeland, and so that myth, I think, is a huge one of who our nation is, who the Métis nation is. I think is huge. As much as for Métis people, we love a good sash, we love a good jig, a good fiddle, of course. Who doesn't? But we're so much more than that, right? And you can find our people, CEOs of organizations, head of nonprofits, in the business sector, in the not-for-profit sector, we're everywhere. We're not just one thing. So that's what I encourage Canadians to think about is that we're diverse.
I think I want, non-Indigenous folks to know is how the media portrays us, is not how we are. We're welcoming people. In our community, we have a resort, the M&M Resort in northern Saskatchewan, and we're now trying to get some of tourists up to an Indigenous community just to come and see the realities we face. We have stories that are hidden from Canada that we would love to share with non-Indigenous folks as well. So.
If folks name drop you, Dallas, do they get a discount?
Yes.
Yes.
I want non-Indigenous people to know that you are not entitled to our stories and our knowledge. I may come off strong saying that, but it is something that's happening a lot right now, where people are asking us very, very personal questions and expecting us to just offer any knowledge or any any parts of ourselves to them as a way to support their learning. And some of us are ready to do that. Some of us are willing to share, and depending on the circumstances, that is appropriate, and that is about moving us forward. But that has to be done very carefully and respectfully. And to be honest, I'm a little bit tired of people, having those expectations and doing it carelessly. So if you're going to be approaching our young people or elders, anyone in our communities to share valuable knowledge with you, think about what are the protocols for how you can ask for that information, and what is your commitment beyond just that one conversation, because our stories are sacred, and we have to protect them as much as we have to protect ourselves.
I don't want to just highlight bad things, but it can be hard, especially on a day-to-day basis. Like, even just going to go buy a bag of chips, the amount of eyes I get, the amount of people I get following me in the store. Like, I'm not out there staring at you and following you. So it's just those assumptions that we see on a day-to-day gets kind of tiring, overwhelming. Sometimes you just want to yell, but there's no point.
Thank you. We just got a question in from Dylan Peters. He asks, how can the government or other important groups give more prominence to grassroots Indigenous organizations and give these groups more awareness?
May I? Right. If having government groups, government departments, if there was a day in their schedule where it's, hey, today is Indigenous Peoples Awareness Day, and the employees will go have workshops taught to them about an Indigenous group, and just having that knowledge spread and the awareness would be a big step in having people realize what has to be done, and in turn, in longer term, help organizations such as CRE or any grassroots NGO do what we do, accomplish the mission.
I think this ties to one of the TRC calls to action really well. So TRC call to action number 66 is talking about multi-year funding for community-based organizations and doing work for young people. And so I think looking at how the support to grassroots initiatives can be done in new ways, because the processes that are in place right now very much exclude grassroots initiatives. And so how can we start getting rid of some of that red tape and celebrating the work that's already being done? Because I think, speaking to Justin's words around Indigenous innovation, there's so many things that have been working well in our communities that we need to take and just keep building on. So supporting us to do that and creating policies and processes that will actually continue that good work.
Yeah, I think young people and grassroots organizations in particular are really responding to the needs in community and have the answers, I think, to a lot of the challenges that we're facing today. And so I think for government, for other organizations, yeah, I mean, it comes down to resourcing, right? So it's putting those dollars to support that work that young people and grassroots organizations are doing, because oftentimes, and those folks are doing that work for free because it's work that needs to be done. And although that's important, that we give back to our communities is really, really important work. But people also need to eat, and I think so we need to, money matters. So I think we need to resource that work. I think we need to amplify, as I said before, right, amplify those stories of change, of good work that's happening across the country. And so whether that's through social media, if governments, if any organization, if they're profiling young Indigenous people who are making change in their communities, I think that goes a long way. I think governments, the corporate sector, all of these spaces, they're regularly purchasing products, they're bringing in consultants and services. And so how can those organizations look to bringing on Grassroots, Indigenous young people to do trainings in their organization to rethink how they work, right? In this era of reconciliation, government, not-for-profit sector, corporate sector, all folks are really interested in what they can do. And I think part of that is when you, the word that people procure, when you bring on consultants, when you sign contracts with people, be intentional about that, right? And think about how you can use that money to resource and bring in grassroots and Indigenous leaders to do trainings for your team. If you're hiring a communications person, a communications consulting firm, look to Indigenous folks for that, because we are, as I said, we're in all these different spaces. So. Put the money there in the hands of young people, because we have the answers to many of the challenges that our communities are facing. Bring young people, bring Indigenous folks into your environments, into your places of work to help you rethink how you work. I think is important, and amplify those voices of young people, of Indigenous people through social media and any other things that you do.
Great. We have a question from Thegwan Thundersky. How do we encourage our youth to go into post-secondary education? Justin, you just talked about, money matters. We need to have young Indigenous people being welcomed into the Canadian economy, into the job sector. So how do we encourage young people to enter into post-secondary education? Dallas, you're a university student. Maybe you want to start us off with how you got to university.
I think, encouraging. My mother was the first of her family to pursue her post-secondary education, and I followed after. And on my dad's side, I was the first out of my siblings, and so it was difficult. It was difficult leaving your community. It was difficult leaving home, especially one of the reasons being was I wasn't sure if my elders were going to be there when I returned, and so. And I think it's important to note that there's always going to be someone there to carry on the knowledge, and so with that, take a step into the uncomfortable. I would have to say to the students, grade 12. Students who are watching, and come to the University of Saskatchewan, and no, they didn't pay for my trip here, so find a university that fits, and come for a year, try it out. If you don't like it, return home. It's as simple as that. And so, yeah.
One of the things that I talk to other young people about in supporting that process of going to post-secondary is around the concept of two-eyed seeing. And how we can balance Western ways of knowing with our traditional ways of knowing as well, and not having to compromise. Sometimes it's also a misunderstanding that we don't want to at all be in those institutions, or we don't want to learn Western knowledge, but that's not the case. Both sides of things can be kept in balance and can offer us important learning. And so for our young people, when you're going into those spaces, to be open, to be ready to learn and to see these different perspectives, but to stay rooted in who you are, and to surround yourself and keep connected to the people that can, support you in that.
I think, too, I agree with Lindsay. You learn so much about yourself when you go to post-secondary school. And know that all or most universities have a center for us. And you meet so many people. It's fun.
Yeah, I think you're right, Karen. I think I had a lot of fun in university, and it really helped to transform the person I am today. Made a lot of lifelong friendships through there. I agree. I think finding those spaces on campus where you can feel comfortable to be yourself, because being truthful. There'll be times when you're in university where it is hard, where it does feel uncomfortable, where you feel like you don't belong. But again, recognize there's people there. There's more and more Indigenous folks attending post-secondary education. There will be peers there for you to find. And there's mentors, right? There will be professors there. There will be students who are in their final years who will be there to support you. And so to find those mentors around you, those people who will be there for late night conversations when you're struggling with homework, when you're not sure, which question you're going to answer when you're writing your essay the night before it's due. You'll make those connections. Those people are there, and there are those supports there. So, similar to Dallas, I think if you're interested, if there's something you're passionate about, try not to let fear stand in the way. Because when you're there, you will build those relationships. You'll find those connections, those people who will be there to support you.
I think a big part of it is like supporting throughout high school, because I know for myself personally, I didn't even think graduation like from grade 12 was possible. So when I graduated, it was like, whoa, like now like I did something that I didn't even think was possible, and then I went to university. So for me, like it's just supporting through high school first, because university is not for everyone. There's a lot of really successful people out there without a degree from any university, but if something you're interested in, there is support. So
now we're getting closer to the end of our time together. I want to make sure that we're able to talk about what are some things that people can do in concrete terms to advance reconciliation. So what are some things that you can think of? They could be big or they could be small ways or small things that anybody who's watching could do to promote reconciliation or to advance reconciliation.
So I wrote something down, and I'm going to read it. So Canadian Roots Exchange has given me a different perspective of reconciliation, colonization, and the process to decolonize. Colonization is violence. In order to decolonize, we need to listen to each other. To create reconciliation, to create reconciliation, the youth with CRE listen to each other's history, whether it be from the colonizer's perspective or the Indigenous. Colonization is violence. We are creating spaces in our communities to decolonize and to stop the violence that has been happening for a long time. CRE's YRI is giving space for each person to listen to each other. So that's another perspective, I guess, I have of reconciliation. I know it's very, like, you have to reconcile with yourself first, and then take in that information, or like, but be ready, like, because you're gonna learn lots of hard truths.
I think one of the first things you can do as a board member of Canadian Roots Exchange is donate to Canadian Roots Exchange. No, I'm just, well, if you want to, feel free to donate. But I think there's so many things. I think one is taking a hard look at yourself. For non-Indigenous people in particular, and think hard about those stereotypes that you hold, those subtle acts of subtle or overt parts of forms of racism that you either participate in or don't call out. Take a stand against racism, and I think that's a really key part. It will be uncomfortable, no doubt, but we need those allies. We need those people to stand up and say things aren't okay. Whether you're walking down the street and someone says something, or it's in your own family, we need those people. We need folks who are standing in solidarity, who call those kind of things out. I think that goes a long way. I think another thing, if you're in positions of power, of influence, where you have access to particular spaces, bring and find ways to get Indigenous people into those spaces. I think there are so many of us who are brilliant, who are talented, who have so much to offer, and sometimes we just need someone to open the door, and once we're there, we can handle ourselves. So sometimes if you have that power, that influence, to find ways to get Indigenous peoples into those spaces as well, and let us do our thing. We know what we're doing, and sometimes those doors have been just closed off for us for too long. Yeah, and I think just finding those people in your community. There are so many, and I love the question around grassroots work, because that's part of where my passion is finding that work that's happening in community, that grassroots work, and finding what you can do to support it, because it's at that level, the community level, the grassroots work, where change really comes from and where it really happens. So find ways to support those things.
Yeah, let us lead the way. It's not that radical of a thought, you know, if we're trying to repair this relationship and all the harm that's been done against our communities, you know, stop sidelining us in our own conversations. I was so excited to be part of this panel because, you know, this space is ours. It's not just one Indigenous person sitting with a bunch of other folks trying to represent all of our views. Like, center us in this process. There's a place for allies, there's a place for non-Indigenous people, and huge responsibility on their shoulders, but take direction from us and let us actually lead the way and do things how we see best fit, because the needs and priorities of our communities cannot be defined by your views, but they can be supported with adequate resources and different forms of allyship.
Learn where you come from and learn from others where they come from. Is as simple as I want to keep it right now.
I think to the, I guess, business owners and also organizations, you know, create a space for an Indigenous person for an internship. I think that's, you know, there's a lot of Indigenous folks who want to learn what it feels like to be in a specific job before actually pursuing it, maybe in a post-secondary institution of one. So you know, create a space for them to grow, create a space for them, make sure that there's an open environment for them, and yeah.
And I would just say learn and unlearn. So learn about the land you live on, learn about its history, learn about current events, and unlearn any stereotypes you still hold, if you hold any.
That's great. The final question I want to pose to you from Guy Levesque, it just came in, is what is the most important issue faced by Indigenous youth? And maybe we can turn that into what is something that you're passionate about? What is an issue that you're organizing around? What keeps you going? What keeps you motivated? What gets you out of bed in the morning? Just a question to end up on. Start over here.
Okay, so what I'm passionate about is having youth, empowering youth to realize that we can move forward ourselves. Like, we can do it. We have the tools, or we can obtain the tools necessary, but we have like the heart. We have what it takes here to make those things happen. Just, I think the empowerment is simple. Yeah, just right there.
I'm personally very passionate about policy. I like finding new, innovative ways to get through specific policy. I've especially in some of the old jobs that I had. You know, if there's a policy that prevented me from doing something, I would, you know, talk to the boss to maybe make it a bit more flexible or figure out a way to get around that policy. And I think that's the, you know, there have been a lot of policies as an Indigenous person that has held us down, but and that's one of the reasons why I'm passionate about it, is to find new ways through it, and yeah.
I'm passionate about reclaiming the streets, making people feel safe in the inner city, making it a place, you know, like if it's your community and it's where you come from, it's where you belong, and you should feel safe where you belong. So that's what I'm passionate about.
Sure, I can go. I mean, yeah, passionate about a lot of things. I think in the urban context, that's a lot of my that's been my experience for most of my life is retelling and reclaiming the city. You know, as I said earlier, it's You know, the city is still Indigenous territories. Our people have lived there since cities were built, and so retelling and uncovering those stories about the city, I think, is something I love. I love hearing those stories about what was taking place, you know, in cities across this country, you know, prior to contact, and all the way up to today. So uncovering and retelling and basically inserting Indigenous language and Indigenous stories and all of those things right on top of the city.
What was the question?
What is something that you're passionate about, an issue that's really important to you?
Okay. I'm passionate about, it's going to sound weird, okay. I'm passionate about listening to stories, or like listening and questioning, I guess. I don't know how to word that, but yeah.
No, I think that's a good answer. I would say for myself, something that hasn't been brought up is around protecting our families. So I am a social worker as well as an educator, and a lot of people don't realize that there are more Indigenous children in care than at the height of residential schools. So contemporary or current colonialism, that is one perfect example of it. And there's some incredible activists and people in our communities that are fighting to bring that to the forefront and to make those changes, like Cindy Blackstock. And we need to keep talking about that. So while a lot of my work is focused on youth, the bigger picture for me right now is how do we protect our families? And because we can't heal, we can't even talk about reconciliation if we're continuing to be facing this violence and we're not even together. So let's talk about child welfare, let's talk about other basic needs that a lot of people in our communities don't have. How many of our communities have boiled water advisories still? Even though there have been promises made of that changing. So let's hold our leadership accountable for making that change happen, because just like we need our families to be together to move forward, we also need our basic needs met, including water and the land being first and foremost.
That's great. So for those watching at home, whether you be in the nonprofit sector or corporate Canada, or just an everyday Canadian, these are the things that young people are passionate about. These are the issues that we're speaking about. These are the issues that we want to talk about. I mean, I think Lindsay said it perfectly during this panel, was that we don't want to be one representative on a panel. We want more spaces that are Indigenous, like this panel. One final question, just before we wrap up, that I would pose to each of you is that if there was one thing that you could do to improve the understanding that Canadians have about our people, what would it be? If there's one thing you could do to improve the understanding that Canadians have, what would it be?
I think a few folks have named it already, but I think know the territories that you're on, know whose land that is, and take the time to understand the agreements, the treaties, the history of relationships between Indigenous people, but also between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, because in particular parts of this country, where treaties have been signed, those were signed to dictate our relationships, how we would coexist and how we would live together on these lands. So return to those things, right? Understand whose land it is. Know the languages that are spoken there, the treaties that cover those territories. And if you're feeling particularly eager, take the time to learn some of those languages yourself, right? Gain a little bit, so you can speak a little bit of the Indigenous languages on the territories that you live.
Learn that we have values, and we have unique values, just like every person does. Everyone has their own values, and there are reasons to those values, and so just being aware of that. We all have our underlying values, or reasons to the ones we have.
I would encourage people to question, are they ready to give up power? Sometimes these conversations get left in a I don't know, kind of fluffy area where we're just talking theoretically. Reconciliation needs to be implemented in real, practical, meaningful ways. And so if you're using the buzzwords, but you're not actually actively giving up power in different ways, whether that's just in a space, taking up less space, or actually handing over physical resources, creating laws and policies that can, respect self-determination. All of these things, truly question that, because if it is about buzzwords, if it is just about campaigns and whatnot, like we don't want to hear that. We have real hope, some of us, for the future of this country. But again, if it's not actual meaningful change that's happening, then I think we may need to put that term reconciliation on hold.
If you could change one thing about what Canadians think about us, one misunderstanding, what would it be?
That's a hard question.
It's a very hard question.
Just one?
Just one. We could talk all day. But what's just one thing that you could, if you could change, or if you could educate Canadians on, what would it be?
Just, I don't know, I guess as simple as it is, put yourself in our shoes, What would it feel like to be an Indigenous person for one day? Would you like, would you want to experience that? I think would you want to have to be put through convincing Canadians to listen to us?
And we're not all the same. We're so many different Indigenous peoples in Canada. Even this panel, like we're all different.
Can I throw that one back to you? Actually, I'm curious your thoughts.
I'm the moderator here. I'm not answering the question. I think that there are.
As you continue.
As I continue. If I was just to answer one question, I think there's a great level of understanding that's coming in this country. Canadians are beginning to understand. Going back to talking about education, in Saskatchewan, there's mandatory education around treaties, and that's something that I didn't have when I was in elementary school or high school. So I think, we talk about the things that we'd like to change. We talk about needing to see these spaces more. We talk about needing more respect, all these sorts of things. I think that's coming. I'm hopeful that that's coming, because I see what's happening in schools, and I think we all see what's happening in younger generations, that there's a change happening, there's a consciousness that's happening around Indigenous issues. So, I think for me, when I think about what Canadians need to do, it's listen to their kids, even if in their kindergarten, grade 1, because oftentimes they know a whole lot more about Indigenous issues than their parents do. Does anybody have any final comments on this one? No? You good? Good? Great. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. How did that fly by? My goodness. I really want to thank all of our viewers who sent in questions. I'm sorry if we didn't have time to get to all of them. This has been really enlightening, I think, for everyone who's been watching. There's a breadth of experience. Some of my favorite people in the world are on this panel right now. So I want to thank you for giving Canada the time, your expertise and your knowledge. This has been Youth Live Canada in partnership with Canadian Roots Exchange. I want to thank the Government of Canada for convening this panel, and encourage you to keep the conversation going. Continue to use the hashtag. Keep the conversation going on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, and in your day-to-day lives. This is an important issue. Reconciliation isn't going anywhere. Indigenous people aren't going anywhere. So let's sit down and let's talk to each other. Thanks so much, everybody. Take care.